The military-industrial complex has guaranteed that the Pentagon is heavily involved in many, if not most, of this country's major economic and political decisions. But you might not know that the Defense Department is also heavily interested in cultural and sociological aspects of the world, too. In fact, in 2008, the DoD launched the Minerva Research Initiative, a multi-million-dollar program to, quote, improve DoD's basic understanding of the social, cultural, behavioral, and political forces that shape regions of the world of strategic importance to the U.S. But according to a recent article written by Guardian journalist Nafeez Ahmed, the Pentagon is working in conjunction with major U.S. universities to militarize social science and prepare for global civil breakdown. Earlier, Nafeez joined me to discuss the Minerva Initiative, and I started by asking him about one particular study that set out to discover why protesters don't become terrorists.
This was a really interesting study because this was where they really did blur the boundaries a lot. So originally the study was supposed to be focused on looking at what are the things that kind of stop peaceful activists who support so-called radical causes, to quote the project. What stops them from getting involved in kind of crossing that line and becoming involved in some kind of terrorist activity or some kind of political violence. So the idea was that what they'll do is analyze normal, everyday kind of social movements, peaceful NGOs, to try and understand what is it that stops them from becoming involved in political violence. But what was really interesting and disturbing about that project is that even though they kind of said that that's the point of the research, when they actually categorized these activists that they were studying, they specifically categorized peaceful activists as supporters of political violence. So even if you are not engaged in what might be described as political violence, if you're a member of a group that is in somehow questioning the status quo or calling into question government policy or being active on the environment or calling into question corporate policies, then you could be seen as a supporter of political violence. So this is really what was really disturbing about this, was the way in which the boundaries between activism, social movements, and kind of radical causes were somehow being equated with terrorist activity or a threat to national security, which is really worrying. And there's absolutely no grounds for that kind of conclusion to be drawn when we look at who is actually involved in terrorist activity.
What, in your mind, are the biggest dangers of weaponizing social science and cultural anthropological studies?
Well, I think one of the biggest dangers, of course, is that by absorbing civilian institutions into what is actually a very narrow, parochial military agenda, what is happening is that objective, independent social science scholarship is, on these issues is being prevented. Instead, so we have this, and I've experienced this myself, and my colleagues in social science have experienced it, where there is now this, there's people academics like anybody, independent media or anyone, activists are, they need money, they need funding for their research. Now all the big money is coming from the security industry and the defense industry. So you have the defense industry, in effect, controlling the discourse, controlling the discourse on counterterrorism, on security studies, on international politics. These are crucial subject areas that students are going into, they're learning from. And the idea really is that we want our students to be getting an independent and impartial understanding, which can input in a meaningful way into policy, which can give policymakers good tools to really understand the way the world works and make good decisions. Instead, what's happening is we have this very narrow agenda, which is co-opting that discourse, co-opting that research, and really, constraining it. And that's where we have this very Orwellian trajectory towards controlling information and essentially determining what kind of truth is legitimate and what kind of truth is illegitimate.
Right, just using these studies to exploit the cultures that you want to, I guess, seize upon. The Minerva program is also being used as a method for studying societal breakdowns due to climate change. This is extremely fascinating. Considering that the Pentagon is the largest polluting institution in the world, why do you think defense officials are suddenly so interested in studying the societal impact of climate change?
Well, again, it's a very good question because, as we know, in terms of meaningful action to address climate change, scientists across the board have been telling us that even our current emissions reductions targets are just not enough. And they will still guarantee disaster. And that even is, even the Obama administration's recent measures, which are most welcome, are still, again, within that danger trajectory. At the same time, however, we've got the Pentagon funding this kind of research, which is really about trying to track, well, what are the consequences when climate change does happen? How is it going to make societies kind of more vulnerable to the kind of extreme weather events that we've been seeing over the last few years? How is that going to make them more vulnerable? And what kind of planning do we need to put in place to ensure that Western interests, US interests, aren't damaged? And this takes me back to the Ministry of Defense research that I was talking about, which of course is very, very interrelated with the Pentagon. We have a special relationship here with the US and the UK. And that research is looking very much at how we need to maintain the functioning of the global economy and access to distant resources, access to potentially endangered supply chains in the context of climate change, in the context of all of these other kind of uncertainties such as energy depletion or economic crisis. So this is really about how do we maintain business as usual? How do we keep the system going when costs are increasing, when dangers are increasing? How do we, and also, of course, when that's making more and more people angry and upset and they want change, how do we keep things going? And how can we be aware of where those things are going to hit and where those vulnerabilities are going to hit in the future so we can be prepared? So this is actually, again, about empowering the existing system, which is actually creating these crises, rather than transforming that system so that we can somehow prevent or mitigate those crises and actually maybe transform things for the benefit of most of the people on the planet. Instead, this is about really, in effect, this is a defense manifesto for the 1%.
Right. Right, no, exactly. And on the other hand, you see the establishment actively suppressing the information about climate change. This is highly disturbing, Nafeez. You wrote an article about the IPCC, which is the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel that releases the most comprehensive reports on climate change. But according to your article, these reports have actually been diluted thanks to pressure from the world's superpower countries. Talk specifically about how these reports are diluted and what evidence there is that this is happening.
So there's been a number of reports talking about how the various elements of the IPCC summaries for policymakers have been diluted. So that doesn't apply to the large body of technical reports, which is goes into thousands of pages. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is the summary documents which are presented to policymakers. And that's supposed to obviously determine the policies that are then decided and what we need to do to mitigate climate change, etc. The problem is that the policymakers themselves appear to be actually influencing what they're being presented in those summaries. So what's actually been happening, and this goes across, there's been a lot of debate about the mitigation reports, but less attention has been paid to the actual scientific assessments for the impacts of climate change. So the article that I wrote was looking at information that I got from a guy called David Wasdell, who was previously a reviewer of the IPCC in 2007. And this time round, he had contact with a number of leading scientists who were involved in that process, where the working groups were liaising with policymakers to finalize the summary. And in that, he said that he gave quite a lot of detail, actually, in how a number of leading, very powerful countries, who happened to be the countries that were most responsible for greenhouse gases. And he said this were the United States, China, Saudi Arabia. Interestingly, he said Saudi Arabia actually led the kind of push to really water down these summaries. And he said that what they were trying to do was dilute the extent to which the impacts of climate change were seen to be leading to drastic consequences in terms of the need for greenhouse gas reductions. So that was the upshot, and they actually asked for certain diagrams to be removed, and they called for certain diagrams which were projecting emissions, the emissions trajectory over the next couple of decades. They wanted that to be watered down, and they also wanted detailed data on the nature of greenhouse gas reductions that were required over the next few decades to be watered down as well. So this was very, very worrying, and a lot of independent academics who were members of these working groups and who were giving advice at many stages of these processes actually came on the record in a number of publications, not just The Guardian, and actually confirmed that this was happening, and they were very worried that there was a real effort here by the most powerful polluters in the world to essentially water down the kind of policy prescriptions that might be asked upon them in order to avoid dangerous climate change.
It's just unbelievable that we can't even trust the UN to provide the severity and scope of the problem here, Nafeez. I know that you responded to Russell Brand's call for revolution. I wanted to wrap this up by kind of getting your assessment on what the hell we can do. Is it just a matter of completely operating outside the system at this point, Nafeez?
I recently interviewed a really interesting guy by the name of Robert Steele, who has an exemplary record in the intelligence community. He's a former CIA case officer, and he also co-founded the U.S. Marine Intelligence Command, which is one of the major U.S. intelligence agencies. And this guy basically is a pioneer of what is known as open source intelligence, which is effectively not gaining intelligence through secret methods, but gaining intelligence through public information, public sources, whether it's open research, universities or research that it's held in some form in the public domain, and using that to inform decisions. And what he's argued is that most of the intelligence that is gained from secret methods is actually largely useless, and he says only 3 to 4% of it is actually operationally useful. So most information that's actually useful for decisions at a government level is actually open source. And he's been campaigning for this for a lifetime. And in his interview with me, he actually said that he believes that the preconditions for revolution, and by that he meant a complete overhaul of the existing system, is actually present in the United States and in Britain and in many Western countries. And he based this on his graduate thesis that he did in 1970, and he produced a very interesting kind of matrix on the preconditions of revolution, which you can find on my Guardian article, which is available online. And he basically said that he believes that all we need really is a trigger, effectively, for something like our version of a Tunisian fruit seller. That trigger that's going to really catalyze people to take action. And I asked him, what's to prevent this from becoming, something which is quite regressive and violent. And as we've seen with the Arab Spring, things haven't exactly gone very well over there. In fact, things are in many ways going backwards. And he said, well, there's no guarantee of that sort of thing, but he said there's a lot of reason to hope. If we look at a lot of the developments that are happening in politics and in economy, in ideology, in information, he's been highlighting actual real-life changes that are going on now, where we've seen participatory methods opening up and new innovations in how to organize ourselves socially, how to mobilize on social media, how to basically develop kind of new ways of doing things economically, whether it's Bitcoin, whether it's virtual currencies, whether it's using the internet to communicate with each other. He's pointed to a whole range of really exciting new paradigms that are currently emerging.
I think he's dead on, and so are you, Nafeez. You're constantly writing these mind-blowing articles for The Guardian. Everyone check it out. Nafeez Ahmed, thank you so much for sharing your insight on the world. And I started by asking him about one particular study that set out to discover why protesters don't become terrorists.
This was a really interesting study because this was where they really did blur the boundaries a lot. So originally the study was supposed to be focused on looking at what are the things that kind of stop peaceful activists who support so-called radical causes, to quote the project. What stops them from getting involved in kind of crossing that line and becoming involved in some kind of terrorist activity or some kind of political violence? So the idea was that what they'll do is
the military-industrial complex has guaranteed that the Pentagon is heavily involved in many, if not most, of this country's major economic and political regions of the world of strategic importance to the U.S. But according to a recent article written by Guardian journalist Nafeez Ahmed, the Pentagon is working in conjunction with major U.S. universities to militarize social science and prepare for global civil breakdown. Earlier, Nafeez joined me to discuss the Minerva Initiative decisions. But you might not know that the Defense Department's also heavily interested in cultural and sociological aspects of the world, too. In fact, in 2008, the DoD launched the Minerva Research Initiative, a multi-million-dollar program to, quote, improve DoD's basic understanding of the social, cultural, behavioral, and political forces that shape